The leather-bound diary sat on the wooden table like a ticking bomb, and Ethan couldn't stop staring at his own handwriting scrawled across its pages. The ink was fresh. The dates began tomorrow, and every entry described, in meticulous detail, how he was going to die. His hands trembled as he turned to the final page, dated 72 hours from now. The last line read, "The ice cracked at 11:47 p.m. I heard myself scream, but the sound died in my throat as the water pulled me under. This is where it ends. This is where I end." Ethan slammed the diary shut, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts that fogged in the cold mountain air. The cabin's single light bulb swung gently overhead, casting dancing shadows across the knotted pine walls. Outside, the wind howled through the trees of Banff's wilderness, a low moan that sounded almost human. He had arrived at Cabin 9 3 hours ago, seeking exactly what the tourism website had promised: solitude, disconnection, and a chance to escape the suffocating pressure of his final semester at university. 22 years old and already drowning in expectations he never asked for, Ethan had thrown his backpack into his old Honda and driven north from Calgary into the Canadian Rockies without telling anyone where he was going. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just him and the mountains, and the blessed silence of being alone. The cabin had seemed perfect when he first pushed open the unlocked door. Rustic but clean, with a wood-burning stove, a narrow bed pushed against one wall, and windows that framed the snow-dusted peaks like landscape paintings. The air inside had been stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of pine, and something else he couldn't quite place. Something metallic and organic, like old pennies left in the rain. He had started unpacking, humming to himself as he stacked canned soup and instant coffee on the rough-hewn shelves. That's when he saw it. The diary, sitting perfectly centered on the table as if placed there deliberately for him to find. No dust on its cover, no wear on its spine, just waiting. The first entry had stolen his breath. Day 1. I arrived at Cabin 9 today looking for peace. Instead, I found this diary, my own diary, written in my own hand. I know I've never been here before, but the handwriting doesn't lie. Neither do the dates. Tomorrow, something begins. In 72 hours, it ends. Ethan had laughed at first, a nervous, brittle sound that echoed too loudly in the empty cabin. Some kind of prank, he told himself. Maybe the cabin's owner had a twisted sense of humor. Maybe previous guests played elaborate games to scare each other. But even as he formed these explanations, his fingers traced the familiar loops and slants of his own penmanship. The way he always crossed his T's with a slight upward flourish. The distinctive way he wrote the number 7 with a line through it. This was his handwriting. Undeniably, impossibly his. He flipped through the pages again, reading faster now, his eyes catching fragments that made his stomach clench. Day 2. The scratching in the wall started at dawn. 3 distinct patterns. I tried to leave, but the road was blocked. Not by snow, by something else. And then, Day 3. I saw myself today, standing at the edge of the frozen lake. He was wearing my blue jacket, the one I'm wearing right now. He turned and looked directly at me, and his eyes were empty. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his chest, feeling the familiar fabric of his blue North Face jacket. He had owned it for 3 years, bought it with money from his summer job at the campus bookstore. The idea that he could see himself wearing it, that there could be another version of him here, made reality feel slippery and uncertain. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like fingernails on a coffin lid. He needed air. He needed to think. This had to be explainable. Ethan stepped out onto the narrow porch, and the cold hit him like a physical force. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and deep purple. The forest surrounded the cabin on 3 sides, dense and dark, while the 4th side opened onto a frozen lake that stretched out like a sheet of fractured glass. Beautiful and treacherous. According to the diary, that lake would kill him in 3 days. He should leave. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to get in his car and drive back to civilization, back to people and lights and explanations that made sense. But when he turned toward where he had parked his Honda, his blood went cold. The car was gone. Not moved, not stolen, simply absent, as if it had never existed. Fresh snow covered the ground where tire tracks should have been, smooth and undisturbed. Ethan ran to the spot, his boots crunching through the powder, his breath coming in panicked gasps. He dropped to his knees and dug frantically with his bare hands, searching for any evidence that his car had been there, but found only frozen earth and pine needles. "No, no, no," he whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He pulled out his phone, already knowing what he would see. No signal. The battery icon showed 73%, but the screen might as well have been a brick for all the good it did him here. The scratching started as darkness fell. Ethan had retreated back into the cabin, locking the door with shaking hands and pushing the table against it for good measure. He lit the wood stove, more for comfort than warmth, and sat on the bed with the diary open in his lap. The scratching came from inside the walls, just as the diary had predicted. 3 distinct patterns. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, pause, scratch. Pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. It sounded like fingernails. Human fingernails, dragging slowly across the wood from the inside. "It's just mice," Ethan said aloud, his voice rough and unconvincing. "Or squirrels. Old cabins have animals in the walls all the time." But the scratching moved. It started near the ceiling in the northwest corner, then traced a deliberate path down the wall, across the floor, and up the opposite side. No animal moved like that. Nothing natural followed such a precise geometric route. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from his pack and shone it at the walls, searching for holes or gaps where something could be getting in. The beam illuminated the rough pine boards, the chinked spaces between logs, the old photographs hanging in mismatched frames. He froze, the light landing on one particular photo. It showed the cabin, taken from the same angle as the view from his bed. But in the window, barely visible, was a figure. A young man in a blue jacket, his face pressed against the glass from the inside, looking out with an expression of pure, frozen terror. The photograph was dated 3 days from now. Sleep was impossible, but exhaustion eventually pulled Ethan under sometime after midnight. He dreamed of drowning, of cold water filling his lungs, of looking up through fractured ice at his own face, looking down at him. He woke to daylight and the smell of coffee, fresh coffee, brewing somewhere in the cabin. Ethan sat up so fast he nearly fell off the bed. The wood stove was cold, dead for hours. There was no coffee maker in the cabin, nothing that could produce that rich, bitter aroma that now filled the air. But there it was, unmistakable and impossible. On the table where he had left the diary, sat a steaming mug. His hands were numb as he approached it, every instinct screaming at him not to touch it, not to drink it, not to acknowledge it. The mug was white ceramic with a small chip on the handle. He owned an identical mug at his apartment in Calgary. He had brought it with him on the trip, packed carefully in his backpack. But when he checked his bag, his mug was still there, wrapped in a t-shirt, exactly where he had placed it. "This isn't real," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "This isn't happening." The diary lay open to a new page. The handwriting was messier now, more frantic. "Day 2, I drank the coffee, I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I followed the script, I could change the ending. I was wrong. The coffee tasted like copper and ash. An hour later, I saw myself for the first time." Ethan's eyes flicked to the window, to the frozen lake beyond. The diary continued. "He was standing at the lake's edge, exactly where I knew he would be. My doppelganger, my echo. When our eyes met, I understood. There is no escape. There's never been any escape. This has all happened before." Against every shred of common sense, Ethan found himself walking toward the window. His legs moved as if controlled by someone else, as if the script was already written and he was merely following stage directions laid out by an invisible hand. The lake stretched out before him, its surface a patchwork of ice and dark water, where the current kept it from freezing completely. And there, standing at the edge, was himself. The figure wore his blue jacket, his jeans, his hiking boots. It stood with its back to the cabin, perfectly still, head tilted slightly as if listening to something only it could hear. Ethan's rational mind provided explanations. A mirror trick, a mannequin, someone playing an elaborate prank. But none of these explanations could account for the terrible, bone-deep certainty he felt that the figure at the lake was him. Not a copy, not a twin. Him. The figure turned. Even from this distance, Ethan could see his own face looking back at him. But the eyes were wrong, empty and black, like holes punched through reality. The doppelganger raised one hand, pointing directly at the cabin, directly at the window, directly at Ethan's heart. Then it smiled. Ethan stumbled backward, his hip colliding with the table, sending the coffee mug crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering ceramic was shockingly loud, and when he looked back at the window, the figure was gone. Just the lake and the trees and the indifferent mountains. But in the spilled coffee on the floor, the liquid was spreading in patterns that looked almost like words. Almost like a message. Ethan dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over the pool of dark liquid, and he could swear he saw letters forming. "You can't leave. You never could." The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent. Now it sounded less like fingernails and more like words. Syllables repeated over and over in a rhythm that almost made sense. Ethan pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound came from inside his skull now, reverberating through his bones. He grabbed the diary again, flipping to the final pages. The entries were becoming shorter, more desperate. Day 3. The walls are bleeding, or maybe I'm bleeding. I can't tell anymore. Time is folding in on itself. I keep seeing moments from tomorrow, from yesterday, from hours that haven't happened yet. He keeps appearing, always closer, always watching. And then, in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. I tried to run. I made it to the lake. The ice looked solid. It wasn't. It's never solid. This is the loop. This is the trap. We are caught in the moment of our own death, living it over and over, trying to escape what has already happened. The final entry, dated for tonight at 11:47 p.m., was just one sentence, written over and over until it filled the page. The ice cracks, the ice cracks, the ice cracks. Ethan looked at his watch. 9:15 p.m. Less than 3 hours until the time in the diary. Less than 3 hours until, according to his own handwriting, he would walk out onto the frozen lake and fall through the ice. But he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't walk out there. He would stay in the cabin, barricade the door, wait until morning when surely this nightmare would break and reality would reassert itself. He spent the next 2 hours pacing, checking the windows, feeding wood to the stove until the cabin was sweltering. At 11:30, he wedged himself into the corner farthest from the door, his back against 2 walls, watching the entrance like a prisoner watching the executioner's approach. At 11:45, he heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, measured footsteps that creaked across the wooden planks. A shadow passed across the window. The door handle began to turn, even though he had locked it, even though he had pushed furniture against it. "Stay out," Ethan whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please, just stay out." The door opened. The figure that walked in wore his face, but its eyes were older, sadder, infinitely tired. It looked at Ethan with something like pity, or perhaps recognition. "You're not real," Ethan said. But he was already standing, already moving toward the door, already following the script written in his own hand. The doppelganger spoke for the first time, and its voice was his voice, cracked and hollow. "I thought that too. Every time I think that. But the diary always ends the same way." It turned and walked out into the night, and Ethan followed. He had to follow. That was how the story ended. That was how it always ended. The lake stretched before him, dark and gleaming under a pale moon. The ice looked solid, thick, safe. He knew it wasn't. The diary had told him. But his feet kept moving, carrying him forward, following the other version of himself out onto the frozen surface. Behind him, in the cabin's window, another figure stood watching. This one held a leather-bound diary, its pages blank and waiting to be filled. The ice cracked at 11:47 p.m. Ethan heard himself scream, but the sound died in his throat as the water pulled him under. The cold was absolute, a darkness that erased thought and feeling and self. As consciousness faded, his last thought was crystal clear. Tomorrow, another version of him would arrive at Cabin 9, seeking solitude. Tomorrow, he would find the diary. Tomorrow, the story would begin again. In the cabin, the blank diary began to fill with familiar handwriting. Day 1. I arrived at Cabin 9 today, looking for peace. Instead, I found this diary, my own diary, written in my own hand. I know I've never been here before, but the handwriting doesn't lie. Neither do the dates. Tomorrow, something begins. In 72 hours, it ends. The loop was complete. The loop was eternal. And somewhere in the frozen water beneath the ice, Ethan's body sank into darkness, joining all the other versions of himself that had come before, all the other iterations that had followed the script, all the other souls trapped in 72 hours that would never end.
The scripted casebook remains open. Subscribe to the archive. Share the evidence. Leave your verdict below. Some secrets are better shared.